Alright, so as all of you have probably figured out, this is a lecture about answering the counterplan. It was billed on the schedule as Answering the Counterplans 101, but it really might be Answering the Counterplans 101, 102, 201, 301, etc. There's a lot of stuff to cover, and we're going to kind of blast through for the next 45 minutes or so. I'll try to leave some time for questions, but if you have something that you don't understand, just interrupt me and let me know. Fundamentally, there are exactly 4 answers that you should make to a counterplan in any debate, and they basically fall under the acronym SPOT, which is that you should first identify a solvency deficit of the counterplan, that the counterplan does not solve one or more advantages of the affirmative case. Secondly, you should read one or more permutations on the counterplan, and a permutation is just a combination of the plan and some portion or all of the counterplan. And the permutation should be articulated along with an explanation of how the permutation solves the case, how the permutation resolves the link to the disadd or the net benefit that the counterplan identifies, as well as any other arguments that might be external net benefits to the permutation. Third, you want offense on the counterplan. You want disadds to the counterplan. You want add-ons. You may want to just impact turn the net benefit to the counterplan. And there are a variety of different types of offense that you can read on the counterplan that we will discuss in this lecture. Finally, there's theory, which are just arguments about why the counterplan is illegitimate, and arguments about why the judge should either not vote on the counterplan or should vote against the negative team because of the way in which they read or because of the way in which they operationalize the counterplan in the round. There's also a 5th type of argument, which I'm going to mention briefly but not talk about in much detail, which is that the counterplan still links to the disadd or still links to whatever net benefit that they say the counterplan solves. I sort of put that along with the sort of solvency deficit category. Not only does the counterplan fail to solve the AF, but the counterplan can't even solve the disadd that it identifies. And those are always arguments that you should make as well. So let's start with solvency deficit. A solvency deficit is fundamentally just a reason that the counterplan does not capture all of the advantages of the case. And you don't have to prove that the counterplan doesn't solve any of the case. Oftentimes, the counterplan will solve part of the case, and it will be an uphill battle for you to identify why the counterplan doesn't solve all of the case. For instance, if somebody reads, if you make an argument that, for instance, that the plan is critical to ensure increased sort of skilled immigration to the U.S., which is key to check brain drain and is good for the U.S. economy. If they read an advantage counterplan, maybe to give more H-1B visas, it's likely that that will probably solve whatever immigration impact you've identified in the counterplan. Or if you read an argument that the counterplan, that the affirmative is critical because currently the United States' policy on some issue is going to piss off China, if they say counterplan consult China, there's a pretty good chance that the counterplan will solve that part of the affirmative case. So you don't have to say that the counterplan doesn't solve any of the AF, but what you have to do is you have to identify a portion of the AF that the counterplan doesn't solve, and then explain why that's the most important argument in the round, why that's the biggest impact, and why that is a reason that you should vote for the plan or the permutation as opposed to the counterplan. Again, as we mentioned before, it's also really important to point out when the counterplan links to the disadd, when it fails not only to solve the affirmative case, but also to solve any part of the disadd they've identified. And there are a bunch of different arguments that you can make, and it will sort of vary round to round why the counterplan fails to solve the case. But some just general recurring themes. A lot of times, both in foreign policy debates as well as in econ debates, especially in econ debates, a lot of arguments about business confidence or investor confidence will turn on the extent to which the counterplan either will not be perceived by the market or will be perceived by the market. And so arguments about why the counterplan won't be perceived or why the counterplan will be perceived by investors and why the counterplan as opposed to the plan will trigger sort of a crisis of investor confidence or business confidence, those are really good counterplan solvency arguments. Arguments that the counterplan is unlikely to be perceived internationally or to be perceived by other agents and therefore is unlikely to be modeled are really good counterplan solvency arguments, especially if you read modeling as a 1AC advantage. Any time frame differentials that you can identify between the counterplan and the plan are really important, especially if you win an argument about why whatever impact you've identified in your advantage is likely to short circuit any argument that they make. For instance, if they read an econ advantage to the counterplan, or an econ disad that they say the counterplan purports to solve, but the counterplan is not able to solve your global war extinction advantage, if you're winning an argument that extinction will happen faster than an economic collapse will, then you're likely going to be able to short circuit any argument that they would make about why the counterplan is critical to prevent economic collapse. And this just goes into a debate about time frame and which impact happens quicker. Sometimes you have counterplans where, for instance, it's important for the United States to act unilaterally, or the United States to act multilaterally. It can go either direction. And sometimes, for instance, if you make arguments about why Obama's leadership on a particular issue is critical, having the AU or the EU or China do the plan is never going to capture an argument about why Obama needs to take leadership on this issue right now. Sometimes you'll also have arguments about why the counterplan just can't be implemented. This often happens on domestic policy topics. So arguments, for instance, about why the counterplan would be struck down by the Supreme Court, if you have arguments like that. Arguments about why the counterplan would be preempted by federal law, especially good argument against states' counterplans. Typically funding arguments like there's not enough money to pay for the counterplan doesn't really work, because in partly we seem to live in this world where there's unlimited money, and if we don't have enough money, the government can just go print more. And so, usually those arguments don't work as reasons why the counterplan can't be implemented, although they may be a good link to an inflation disad against the counterplan or something like that. But if you have an argument, for instance, that money has already been appropriated for the relevant budget cycle, then an argument that the counterplan does or doesn't spend the money, probably won't do anything in the short term if you win an argument that the money has already been appropriated and the counterplan can't reverse that. There's some sort of specific arguments on different types of counterplans that you guys should be aware of. On alternate agent counterplans, remember, this is just these debates are debate about which agent should do the plan. Should it be the US or China? Should it be the US or the AU? And in this situation, you always want to be identifying reasons why the agent that the resolution has identified, or if it's a more open-ended resolution, why the agent that you have identified is absolutely key. And again, this also comes up in debates about whether an alternate agent can enact the plan. So it comes up a lot in, for instance, courts v. Congress topics, right? Sometimes it's the case that only the courts are capable of announcing that a right is constitutionally protected. The Congress is unable to protect certain types of rights because there's I won't explain all of it, but there was a case in 1997 called City of Bernie v. Flores, where the Supreme Court said that Congress isn't allowed to enact sort of prophylactic legislation under the 14th Amendment. It could only protect rights that the courts had already recognized. So those, or arguments, for instance, that if you have a patents topic, and you read a state's counterplan, well, the states aren't able to pass patent laws. The Constitution says that only the federal government can pass patent laws. Same thing with bankruptcy. And so sometimes you'll have situations where the alternate agent is just not capable of enacting the plan. Or situations, for instance, where you're having a PKO's debate about who should provide peacekeeping operations in Africa. Arguments about who has the relevant military technology and whether the AU has the right kind of fighter planes, the right kind of bombers, or the right kind of weapons. Those debates will come up in alternate agent debates and are useful solvency deficit type arguments. Again, modeling type arguments are really good here, right? Sometimes you're going to have arguments like it's critical to have US leadership on this issue, critical for the US to act because there's currently a power vacuum. Our uniqueness arguments indicate that China is occupying this power vacuum, which means the US, only agent that's going to be able to counterbalance China. Or sometimes you'll have arguments like that the UN or the AU will be perceived as a puppet of China or the puppet of the US. And sometimes it's really important to have the agent that you've specified in the plan text do the plan. For PICs, remember these are debates about whether it's important to do the entire AF or whether it's important to exclude a small part of the AF. And so in PIC debates, you ideally want to be making an argument about why the thing that the affirmative has excluded is uniquely key, is uniquely good, and usually this would just entail You know, sometimes this will just entail straight turning the net benefit, but sometimes you can make arguments about why doing the entire 1AC is critical, right? And this is especially true in a lot of resolutions where the AF has to pass some like gigantic appropriations bill, and the neg reads a pick. Well, it's likely that whatever they're picking out of was there because it was part of the compromise that was necessary to have the bill passed in the first place. And so if you pick out of that, then it might be that the kind of governing coalition that was necessary to pass that bill is just going to fall apart if it looks like people are going behind their back to like take out the concession that they worked so hard to get. With consult counterplans, if you anticipate that it's a foreign policy, go ahead.
On the previous one?
Yeah.
So is that saying then that the counterplan doesn't have the ability to get passed, or that coalition falls apart in the future, and then you run like a politics dissent to...
Yeah, I mean, you could spin it either way.
Okay.
But for instance, you could make a solvency deficit argument saying that like, oh, well, you know, McCain really wanted this provision to be added to the bill. This doesn't get added, and so McCain's going to put a secret hold on the bill, and either that means the bill like just won't get passed because the coalition's going to fall apart, or that maybe that even if it does eventually get passed, that it's going to slow down the process so much that it's not going to be able to pass the bill before the dissent happens. Again, these sorts of arguments are interesting because they get into debates about whether the counterplan fiat is durable or not. And certainly, if you're negative and somebody makes the argument that, well, this will cause the bill to not get passed or this will cause the bill to get held up, it's always worthwhile making the argument in the block that fiat is durable. Your argument that the counterplan just won't happen is just inconsistent with fiat. But I think you can have a debate about that, about whether those sorts of solvency deficit arguments are good or not. For consultation counterplans, typically these occur in like big foreign policy hedge topics, and so in these sorts of situations, it's always strategic to have sort of a hard power or a hedge advantage, or if you don't want to read a hedge advantage in the 1AC, read it as an add-on, which we'll talk about later. Because oftentimes, in consult debates, the key distinction is about whether the United States should act unilaterally or about whether the United States should act in consultation with somebody else. So any argument about why U.S. leadership is key, about why the U.S. acting swiftly is key, about why U.S. hegemony is key, all of those arguments will be disadvantages to a consult counterplan. The other thing in consult counterplans is that these debates often turn on the question of whether the agent that is being consulted will say yes or no, whether China will say yes or no, whether the EU will say yes or no. And so any risk that China says no to the counterplan is a risk that the plan doesn't get implemented and that the counterplan can't access the impacts of the 1AC. So any risk that whatever country that's being consulted says no is a very plausible solvency deficit that you should always identify in a consultation debate. Advantage counterplans, by their nature, typically don't solve the whole AF. They usually will only solve one advantage in the AF. And so there you just want to sort of isolate why the advantage that they don't solve is more important than the one they do, and is more important than whatever dissat they identify. Finally, with delay and time frame counterplans, these counterplans are theoretically illegitimate, or most people think they are, and we'll talk about that when we get to the T in spot. But again, the problem with delay counterplans is that they delay the implementation of the plan, that the plan happens later. And so any gap in implementation is time in which the plan isn't happening, in which the economy is getting worse, in which people are dying, in which people aren't getting fed. And I think this is a really persuasive framing argument for both the MG and the PMR, that every day that the counterplan delays the implementation of the plan is another day that somebody else dies, is another day that someone goes hungry. And especially if you have sort of like arguments that are a little bit critiquey in your AF, or arguments about how the people who get affected in the status quo are marginalized people, poor people, people who are uniquely victims of discrimination, then every day we delay is a day that's worse for them. Keep in mind too that if you're reading a critical affirmative, you really, really, really want to strongly leverage this against any counterplan, because it's likely that the counterplan is not going to be able to access your methodology or your representations or your ontology, right? For instance, if you read like a Nietzschean AF or like a Foucault genealogy AF, no counterplan is going to be a genealogy. And so you should point that out, right? If the counterplan is unable to access your genealogical method, then that is bad. If you're reading sort of like a narrative, performance, argument about how we should evaluate impacts from our own social location, and it's impossible to sort of debate as if we were policymakers, because there's no way to pretend to be policymakers and divorce ourselves from our own lived experiences, then if the counterplan purports to sort of be like, what should the USFG do, then that probably is not going to jive with your framework arguments about sort of how we need to speak from our own social location, our own subject position. And so that's a deficit of the counterplan that you should identify. If you are reading a movements AF, sometimes it'll be a capitalism AF, sometimes it will be some other social movement that you're trying to spark. You'll probably make arguments in your 1AC about how sort of grassroots movements or bottom-up movements are key because they're sort of organic and they're not co-opted by the government. And so when you have a counterplan that advocates a fiated government action, then it's likely that this counterplan is going to be bad because it will co-opt whatever movement that the 1AC is trying to spark, and thereby the counterplan won't solve the AF. If you have a Heidegger AF, right, you should just say the counterplan is a violent encounter with nature and it seeks to manage the world outside of it, and that's bad. If your AF says cat bad, you should say that the counterplan is capitalist. I mean, these are all kind of straightforward arguments where you just want to leverage whatever your critical position is, and then to use that as a solvent deficit of the counterplan. One thing I would add to this is that if, for whatever reason, you decide to make the claim in your affirmative that fiat isn't real, and that we should talk about representations or discourse or whatever, it is extremely important to not concede the argument that fiat is real, or that the affirmative or the negative can compare a fiated counterplan text to your affirmative. Because that puts you in a position where oftentimes the negative will just get up there in the block and will wave its hands and will say, look, like, I get that your movement's trying to solve, but there's only a chance your movement solve, and you can see that fiat is real, and you can see that our government policy is going to be able to, like, give the land back to the natives. And you don't want to be in a position where you can see that the negative's counterplan is able to do that, right? So you either want to say, no, LOL guys, fiat's not real, or you want to say, this still begs the question of what methodology we should adopt and what our performative stance toward the impacts that are discussed in this round should be, right? You don't want to spot them easy arguments like fiat is real if you are a critical affirmative debating against a policy type negative. So that is the S. Let's talk about the P in spot, which is the permutation. A permutation is a test of competition, and in order to be a legitimate permutation, you have to include all of the plan and part or all of the counterplan. So just some basic review. Can someone tell me why it's important for the affirmative to include why the permutation has to include all of the plan?
Severance.
Right, it's severance. It would be bad for the affirmative to be able to sever out a part of the plan that you say are disadvantageous. It would justify affirmative conditionality, which, as we all know, is the worst thing ever. And here's a pro tip for theory debates. If you can say that whatever they do justifies affirmative conditionality, you're probably going to win. Because there's not a lot of agreement sort of in the community on theory debates. But one thing everyone agrees upon is that affirmative conditionality is bad, and the arguments that justify affirmative conditionality are bad. Because the affirmative, they read a plan, and they have to get stuck with that plan for the rest of the round. So why doesn't the same rule apply to the counterplan? Why is it okay to permute only part of the counterplan?
Because it's a test of competition.
Sure, but what does that mean?
I mean, because you're still passing time, so you're still playing.
Sure. So let's take an example, right? Let's say that the AF, I don't know, what's a plan that somebody's read? Pass CTBT, the comprehensive test ban.
You remember that?
Now, what if the neg says, counterplan, world peace? What's wrong with that counterplan?
Object fiat?
What?
Object fiat?
More
Perp.
fundamentally than object fiat.
Perp solves?
Yeah, it's not competitive, right? What's their answer to permutation, pass CTBT, and have world peace? There's no answer. There's nothing competitive about it. So imagine then that a sneaky negative has a slight rephrasing. and so now the counterplan is world peace and also don't do the plan. Right? So is that a competitive counterplan?
Artificially.
It is artificially competitive. And the way that you prove that that counterplan is artificially competitive is that you say permutation, pass CTBT, and do world peace. And that is a permutation that includes all of the plan and part of the counterplan, right? And you've included all of the non-competitive parts of the counterplan, and that's enough to test the competition of the counterplan. The standard permutation is just do both. Usually, just as a matter of best practices, I don't think this is a good permutation. You should probably explain a little bit what do both means. I'm not convinced that you necessarily need the full text of both the plan and the counterplan. I think that's probably a waste of time and is just kind of cheap and stupid. But again, that's just my opinion, and there's at least one person in this world who has lost on the argument that you did not give us a permutation that included the full text of the plan and the counterplan. And some judges apparently believe that you need to do that. So people will sometimes read a theory argument if you don't have a permutation that includes all the words in the plan and all the words in the counterplan that you're putting into the permutation. So be prepared to answer that argument. You shouldn't need a lot to answer it, but some people will make that argument. Remember that the goal of the permutation is twofold, right? The permutation has to solve the case, and the permutation has to shield the link to the disad that they've identified. So here are two sort of basic examples you're going to see. Imagine that you have an aff that says that Congress should do the plan, and the negative says politics. If Congress does the plan, that will piss off some other people in Congress, and they won't pass, they won't pass the budget bill, and the government will shut down in September, and there'll be economic collapse. So instead, in order to avoid pissing anybody off, because everyone in Congress has hurt feelings, we're going to have the Supreme Court do something that's kind of like the plan, right? You could easily have a permutation where you have Congress and SCOTUS do the same thing at the same time. And then that would very plausibly shield the link to the politics disad, because Congress could claim, look, our hand was forced here, and so don't get pissed off at us. There's no political repercussions, because it's not like we did something unpopular and we have to pay the price. Rather, that it's just that the Supreme Court ruled and we can't overrule the Supreme Court. That's not how it works in the US. Another example, which is a little bit murkier, in which you could have a debate on both ways, and in which people do have debates on both ways, is a foreign policy example, right? Where the affirmative says that the US should send peacekeeping operations to Ghana, the Côte d'Ivoire, Africa, East Timor, whatever. Right? They send PKOs somewhere. And the neg says that the UN should do it, and they say that if the US does it, there will be that there will be backlash, that US hedge is bad, etc. So if you do counterplan, or permutation rather, US plus the UN send peacekeepers, that may or may not shield the link, right? If their argument is that the mere presence of the United States is going to be what pisses off people and is going to be what triggers the link to hedge bad, then yeah, it probably doesn't shield the link. But if the argument is that the US acting unilaterally and acting like it's the big world superpower without the input of other nations or other non-governmental organizations is bad, then the argument that the permutation would be perceived that the US is working in cooperation with the UN, that very plausibly would shield the link to the backlash and hedge disads. And so you just have that debate back and forth. Remember, another pro tip, never, ever, 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 ever concede that the counterplan solves the case. Because if you do, not only have you lost your chance to make one of the only 4 arguments that you can make against a counterplan, but you have also put yourself in a position where it is very difficult to read a permutation, because it's very difficult to prove that the permutation is net beneficial to the counterplan. Right? If the counterplan solves the case, and you concede that the counterplan solves the case, then there's no reason to do the permutation, because there would be no added solvency benefit vis-a-vis for the permutation vis-a-vis the counterplan, and also there would be a risk of the disad, but presumably there would be no risk of the disad in a world where you just did the counterplan, because they've presumably made some arguments that the counterplan solves the link to the disad. So in order to win that the permutation is net beneficial to the counterplan, you probably have to have an argument about why the counterplan alone doesn't solve the AF. One thing I should add to about the permutation, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about intrinsicness, is that occasionally you'll get permutations that are like double permutations, right? For instance, if you say that the U.S. should give 25 million in humanitarian assistance to Haiti, and they say China should give $25 million in humanitarian assistance to Haiti. Then sometimes you get a situation where you're like, hey, China and the U.S. should give money to Haiti, and the net benefit of the permutation is now Haiti has $50 million, right? Or if you have the U.S. and the UN send peacekeeping operations, then you have twice as many troops there. And that's great, because that's like twice as much the peace. And so sometimes people will make these arguments that the permutation's better because it gets double solvency. One argument you can make, and I'm not convinced of the theoretical legitimacy of this argument, is that double solvency arguments, or double solvency permutations are bad because they're functionally intrinsic. That is, that the plan doesn't include $50 million, and the counterplan doesn't include $50 million, but the permutation includes $50 million, and that's an element that's in neither the plan or the counterplan. And so maybe that's a reason that sort of these double solvency permutations are illegitimate, and that's an argument that you might want to make in the MO. Yeah?
Do you think 25 million 25 would be severance?
Why would it be severance?
Because it would be less than in a country's individual amounts. Let's say there's an economic break scenario. Do you think that would be severance? Do you think, what do you think is the middle ground between that?
Well, for instance, I think that having, I think that's the correct answer to the its intrinsic argument, right? Because what are you going to say? You're going to say China gives 12.5 and the U.S. gives 12.5? That's severance, because because your affirmative defended the U.S. giving 25 million. And so it's impossible to resolve that debate because in order for you not to be intrinsic, the U.S. would have to do something that's not in the plan text.
Right.
And that is severance. So I think that's a very plausible response if you're the PMR to the argument that double solvency permutations are illegitimate. So there's also permutation theory arguments that you can make, and that you should sort of be aware of if you're reading permutations in the MG. First of all, there's severance permutations. These are permutations that don't include all of the plan. I'm not going to say much about them, except they're bad, and everyone agrees they're bad. And if you're going to lose a theory debate, it's most likely going to be because your permutation is severance. There's intrinsicness as well. An intrinsic permutation is a permutation that adds some element that is in neither the plan nor the counterplan. These are generally bad because you just can't predict what element that they would add to the permutation that would solve the link to their disadds. And certainly it puts you in a position where the AF would just get to add something new that would fiat away the link to a disad, and that would be really bad for the negative, would destroy stable disad links, it's unfair. But some people seem to think that intrinsicness can be justified as a response to certain types of process counterplans, or quote-unquote cheater counterplans that are artificially competitive. And I'm not going to belabor this point too much, except to say that there are certainly situations where people think that it's okay to read intrinsic perms as an answer to PICs, as an answer to consult counterplans, as an answer to process counterplans like veto Cheeto, which is where, you all know what veto Cheeto is? Veto Cheeto is a counterplan where you say counterplan, Congress passes this law, the president vetoes it, and Congress passes the law again with a 2/3 majority and overrides the veto. And that counterplan presumably competes on normal means because that's not how we normally pass laws. And then they usually read politics as net benefit, and they say there's no solvency differential because the same law gets passed. Nobody likes this counterplan. People seem to think that it's tremendously illegitimate. And so some people think that it is okay to read intrinsic permutations as a response to counterplans like that. There are also time frame permutations, which is where you do the plan, then the counterplan, or do the counterplan, then the plan. A lot of people think that these type of permutations are illegitimate because they mess with the timing of the plan and the counterplan. They also involve future fiat, and most people believe that fiat is when the plan happens or the counterplan passes, that fiat happens immediately, and if you're allowed to manipulate the timing of fiat so that you pass the plan a month in the future or a year in the future, that's bad because it's unpredictable because it would justify passing the plan at any point. It's unpredictable when you would pass the plan, and that this would allow you to sort of just manipulate the timing in order to shield the link to a disadd, which is bad. Yes?
When you say that some of these types of permutations people think that they're illegitimate, does that mean, are you trying to say that we should stay away from those?
No, I'm just trying to say no, I'm not trying to say that. I'm trying to say that you should be prepared for people to make an argument about why that kind of permutation is illegitimate, right? Because you don't want to be in a position where you're like, well, wouldn't the best idea be to pass the plan and then to pass the counterplan like a month later, right? And then somebody's going to say, well, that's unfair, and I don't want you to be in a position where you're the PMR and you have an answer to that argument, right? And the best way to have an answer to that argument is to anticipate that they might run that argument. Yeah, in general, these are all, what I'm trying to do in this lecture is just to sort of flag issues for you guys. I'm not trying to sort of tell you what arguments are good to run or bad to run, except to sort of point out some strategic consequences. Multiple permutations are probably fine, and there's no reason that you shouldn't read them, especially if we all believe that permutations are tests of competition rather than advocacies. Then it seems like there are multiple ways that you could test the competitiveness of any particular counterplan. And so I don't think that you're going to lose on multiple permutations bad unless you say permutations are advocacies, because then you have multiple advocacies and it becomes a little bit more, a more vague question about whether multiple permutations are okay then. And then there's also issues about permutation vagueness. Yeah?
On the multiple permutations, how do you best execute those in like an efficient way? Like, should you have different solvency for every single one of your permutations? Like, how do you do net benefits with multiple permutations? Like,
I think that it would depend on the sort of context that you're reading the permutation. I think that, for instance, I guess I'll sort of lump them into three types. First, there are the permutations that basically exist just to sort of make your opponent spin their wheels or to prove that the counterplan isn't textually competitive. So I'm talking about permutation due to the plan and permutation due to the counterplan primarily. You don't need a ton of explanation for those arguments. Those arguments are basically just to just say that their counterplan is the same thing as the plan, or the counterplan isn't textually competitive. That's usually what those arguments are there for. The second are, and these come up more in critique debates than counterplan debates, but when people read arguments like the juxtaposition perm or the contradictions perm, and there's usually like a discrete philosophical argument that you will read for like each one of those perms, and you can just sort of identify those, like, juxtaposition. And Judith Butler says that putting contradictory ideas, side by side with one another creates a space that we can, have a dialectic about, right? And usually there's like a discrete argument, and it won't interact with the rest of your strategy. If you have multiple permutations that combine the counterplan and the plan in different sort of substantive ways, then I think you want more explanation. And then I think that, it's hard to say in a vacuum sort of how to be more efficient about them, except to say that, basically just, the goal is just to explain what the world of the plan and the counterplan looks like. And finally, permutation vagueness is just proving that the permutation is vague, that you don't know what the permutation means, and that's bad because it'll allow them to shift the meaning of the permutation in later speeches after you've had a chance to make arguments in the MG, and presumably you make arguments of why the MG speech time is the most important, blah, blah, blah. So we're halfway through stop. Now we're at offense. There are three basic types of offense that I want to talk about. The first are disadds to the counterplan, right? Just as you might read a disadd to a plan, you can also read a disadd to a counterplan. It's a new argument in the MG, and it functions just like a disadd that you would read in the LOC. The second are add-ons. Add-ons are new advantages to the AF. And they're distinct from disadds to the counterplan because they're not saying the counterplan will trigger this disadd. They're saying this is another advantage to our affirmative that the counterplan simply can't solve, right? For instance, if you read a big foreign policy AF and the neg says, China should do the plan or consult China, right? It's very easy to read an add-on that's like modeling or Chinese internal politics or, well, Chinese internal politics would probably be like a disadd to the counterplan. But like, for instance, read a modeling argument or a hedge argument. And having China do the plan can't capture a US hedge advantage to the 1AC that you would read in the MG. Finally, you can always just straight turn the net benefit, right? If they say that the plan is critical to make sure that the immigration bill gets passed, you could say the immigration bill is bad. If they say that the plan is critical to prevent an economic collapse, you could say an economic collapse is good. And certainly this is a strategy that people do go for sometimes, and you should be aware of. Remember, when you're reading sort of big pieces of offense against the counterplan, you want to keep them relatively short. You still need an explanation of your argument, and you don't want to be blippy, but you want to be a little bit more condensed than you would be in the LOC, especially because the MG is a very time-pressured speech. And so it's really good to generate new offense in the MG, but you don't want to do so at the expense of making coverage mistakes on other sheets of paper. In general, I think it's usually best to put these kinds of arguments on a new sheet. I think it makes it seem more important perceptually to the judge, and I think it helps everybody's organization in the debate. And I also think that these arguments are really good when paired with an argument about why conditionality or dispositionality is bad, because one, it will sort of prevent your opponent from kicking the counterplan and thereby severing your links to these arguments. And if they do so, it will be proof of abuse. You'll say, we read this big disad to your counterplan, and that you have gotten rid of the link to the disad by kicking the counterplan. That's not cool, that's unfair, you should lose the debate. Again, a disad to the counterplan is basically like a 1NC disad. The one exception is that you don't need extensive uniqueness. Part of this is just because usually you've already developed a lot of the same uniqueness questions when you read the initial disad, that was attached to the counterplan, the LOC, or when you've made your 1AC solvency arguments or the counterplan solvency arguments, right? A lot of those will flesh out the same uniqueness issues that you would usually develop more on a disad. And to some extent, too, counterplans sort of generate uniqueness because they're different than the status quo. And so, to the extent that counterplans are capable of generating uniqueness, then you probably don't need to develop it quite as much for a disad to the counterplan. You probably also should have reasons that the disad means the counterplan can't solve, right? When you read a disad in the LOC, an argument that you should always include in your LOC disad is that the disad turns the case. And similarly, when you're reading a new disad in the MG, you want an argument that the counterplan, that the disad to the counterplan means the counterplan can't solve the case, right? That the counterplan is just not going to do what the counterplan says it should do. So, again, here are some common examples. If somebody reads a Congress or an XO counterplan, you can say politics. If someone has an alternate agent counterplan that has another country do it, you can always read a foreign internal politics disad. You can also do it with consult too. Like if you consult China, there may be the argument that that will create sort of a conflict in the leadership in China, and the people will freak out about that, and that sort of internal political struggle in China will lead to the generals getting mad and something like that. I'm not saying that's a good argument. I'm just saying that oftentimes you can read a plausible internal politics argument as a disad to a counterplan. For courts counterplans, one disad that we like to read in the MG is an argument that if the courts do the counterplan will be unpopular, and Congress will get pissed off, and they will keep holding up Obama's judicial nominations, and that's bad because the courts are currently backlogged, and if we keep holding up judicial nominations, it will grind the country's economy and its justice system to a halt. These are just sort of examples of arguments you could make as a disad to the counterplan. Along the lines of a disad to the counterplan, you can oftentimes read a critique of the counterplan net benefit. And for instance, like if somebody reads a big stick nuclear war impact as their advantage to a counterplan, or as the disad to the AF that the counterplan purports to solve, you can always say that their use in nuclear extinction scenarios is bad because it's threat construction, because it's a form of securitization, etc. Right? And then you can always sort of critique their counterplan, or you can critique their disad representations in addition to, just reading a standard disad the counterplan. Yeah.
Require an alt, or is it just like a critical turn?
Well, no, because it would be just a critical turn usually, because presumably that if it's triggered
Alt's
by, yeah.
Right, that's what I thought.
Yeah,
Right, and you should make an argument about why the affirmative would solve.
Okay.
But yeah, basically just a critical disad. Right, and usually you need an alternative because there's no uniqueness to the critical disad, but presumably the counterplan has generated all the uniqueness you need. Add-ons. These are advantages to the 1AC that the counterplan can't solve. The upside of these is that even if the negative wins conditionality and kicks the counterplan, that still doesn't get rid of the add-on, right? The add-on is functionally just another advantage to the case. The problem is that oftentimes it will be difficult for the add-on to outweigh the disadd. Add-ons can take up a very long time to read in the MG, which can cause some time allocation issues. And oftentimes they're going to end up being sort of generic. I mean, ideally you have a very specific add-on that you can read, and if you think that they're going to read a certain counterplan in the LO, then you can plan during prep to read an add-on, right? And oftentimes then you'll have a really good add-on that's like kind of comparable to the advantage that you would have read, but you just save it for the MG to sandbag them. But sometimes if you come up with sort of a generic add-on, and you write it out in the last 4 minutes of the LOC, it's going to suck. And so if the argument sucks, it's going to be hard to win on it later in the round. There are some judges out there, for instance, Brandon Merrill, who don't think that it's okay to read add-ons. Most judges think they're fine. Frequent examples of add-ons include hedge, relations arguments, modeling arguments, generally just arguments that the counterplan can't solve. The third thing you can do is to sort of turn the net benefit. Again, you sort of basically just impact your link turn, the arguments on the specific net benefit of the counterplan they claim. Don't be afraid of parallel link turns. These are basically just mini disadds. They concede their original link argument, but just says their link argument leads to something else bad happening. You can also critique their impacts. We just talked about that. Remember, too, that you can also have big stick impacts that basically start the debate over in the MG, right? Like if they say that the counterplan, that the plan is bad because it's going to cause China to launch a war in the Senkaku Islands or whatever, you can be like, well, China war inevitable, time to light up China, guys. Or, if they say, well, you're going to lead to economic collapse, you could say economic collapse inevitable, time to de-dev. And those are plausible things. I've seen some teams get rolled by restarting the debate in the MG. It's kind of an advanced strategy. I wouldn't do it all the time, but it's a nice thing to have in your back pocket. The last part of SPOT is theory debates. Theory arguments should go on a separate sheet of paper just because it makes it seem more important to the judge. Most judges really don't like voting on sort of one-liners or cheap shots, and so you should try to develop these arguments. Because if you're going to read these arguments in the MG and sort of waste your time on them, you want them to be good enough that you can go for them with the PMR if you're really forced into a corner. And certainly a lot of PMRs have been won on going for dispositionality bad, or going for consult counterplans bad, or something like that. Remember, a lot of people seem to like to say reject the argument, not the team, on these counterplan theory debates, so you always want to preempt this argument. I think that's usually pretty easy in the context of a counterplan debate, because reject the counterplan doesn't get you anywhere when the counterplan has already been read and the counterplan has already screwed with your strategy, and that's already the advocacy they've chosen in the debate. Right? Think about this, for instance, in the context of a conditionality debate. That, if you say conditional counterplans are bad, rejecting the counterplan doesn't do anything because it just lets them get rid of the counterplan, which is the thing they wanted to do in the first place. And so, in those sorts of situations, you really just need to say, no, you write a conditional counterplan, you don't lose the counterplan, you lose the debate. And I think that starting that debate in the MG is very useful. One theoretical issue that comes up a lot is about the status of the counterplan. Usually when people read counterplans in debate, they would read them unconditionally, which is to say that much as the affirmative sticks with their plan throughout the entire debate, that the negative will stick with their counterplan throughout the entire debate. And so, they advocate the counterplan, quote-unquote, unconditionally. The opposite of unconditionality is conditionality, in which the affirmative reserves the right to kick their counterplan, or the negative reserves the right to kick the counterplan in the block whenever they want. And there are a lot of arguments about why this is bad. It bifurcates the MG time because you don't know whether you're debating against the counterplan or debating against the status quo. It's not reciprocal because the AF doesn't get to kick their plain text, but the neg does. It means there's no stable link to offense or disadds because presumably if you read a bunch of disadds to the counterplan, they could just be like, JK guys, not going for the counterplan, none of your disads link anymore. And that would be bad for you, it's probably unfair, and it's a plausible reason why conditionality might be bad. There are also some good arguments as to why conditionality is good. This is not the lecture for them, but many of us will tell you about why conditionality is good if you ask us. There's also dispositionality. It's like conditionality. The only difference is that dispositionality says that you can kick the counterplan unless you straight turn the counterplan. And so, presumably that's fairer to the affirmative because you can, because then the affirmative can choose to keep the counterplan in the debate by straight turning it. But that really might not be any better than conditionality because you have to read a permutation. I mean, let's be real, right? Everybody reads a permutation in every counterplane debate, and it's not really realistic to protect the affirmative by saying, okay, your choice. You either get to read a permutation or we get to kick the counterplane, right? Not really fair. Some other recurring theory issues that you see, vagueness, just in the same way that a plan text might be vague or it might not specify important parts of the plan text like who the actor is, what the enforcement is, etc. You might also have vagueness or specification issues of the counterplan. A lot of judges really don't like voting on vagueness and spec arguments, but they're viable arguments anyway. You could always talk about the distinction between textual and functional competition. Basically, textual competition means that a counterplan has to be competitive, not based only on the function of the counterplan, but also based on the words of the counterplan. And so, for instance, if a counterplan includes every word that's in the plan text and then just says except something else, then arguably that counterplan is not textually competitive because there's no word in the counterplan or in the plan text that it competes with. It competes on the function of the plan, but there's no word in the plan that it competes with, and so it's not textually competitive. Basically, a good rule of thumb is that if their answer to why the counterplan is competitive is that it competes on normal means, or that it competes because it avoids a politics disad, it's probably not textually competitive, and you have a pretty good permutation argument. Some people seem to think that in these sorts of situations that intrinsicness is justified. There are arguments both ways on that question, and it's kind of hard to broach them here. It's just only like 5 minutes left. One problem with textual competition arguments is that nobody seems to be able to agree on what textual competition is. Everybody thinks that it's a good thing and that it's a good way of limiting out unfair counterplans, but some people do. Kendo doesn't. Some people seem to think that textual competition is good, but of those people who think that textual competition is good, many of them don't seem to agree with one another about what textual competition is. And so it may be difficult to engage in a debate about textual competition is when nobody can really agree on what it means. Some types of counterplans have future fiat or future uniqueness problems. These would include counterplans like delay, condition, consult, where the implementation of the counterplan would happen at some point in the future that's not immediate, and as a result, that you can't make uniqueness arguments for your disads because you don't know what the future looks like. You don't have a crystal ball. And so, in those sorts of situations, you might say that those kind of counterplans are illegitimate because there's no way for you to read a disad on the counterplan because, it's all speculative. Sometimes there are counterplans that are object fiat, which basically means that the counterplan would fiat whatever action, would fiat the actor, the object of the resolution, or the object of the 1AC. To give you an example, if the affirmative reads a counterplan and it says that it avoids war with China, the counterplan, China will not go to war with the United States, is probably object fiat, and it's probably not okay. And you see this sometimes with consult. You see this with some alternate agent counterplans, some advantage counterplans. Some of these are places where you might see object fiat. You might want to identify that. Multiple counterplans present all the same issues as conditional counterplans, except worse, because now instead of just the choice between the counterplan and the status quo, there are multiple counterplans, and so that divides your MG time into thirds or quarters rather than half, and that's even worse for you. You might also want to object to the way in which the counterplan is delivered. For instance, if they don't give you a written copy of the counterplan text, that might be bad because you might not know exactly what the counterplan text says. And you might not be able to generate stable offense against it. If they read the counterplan in the last, in protected time, or in the last 3 minutes of the speech, you may not have a meaningful opportunity to ask about the counterplan or to think about the counterplan. If they don't give you a question about the counterplan, that might be bad too. All of these things are things you can identify. These are just some things, some arguments from back in the day that occasionally come up. Sometimes people will read counterplans where they say that we should study this issue, or that we should do the plan but make some minor modifications to it to make it even better. Or that we should have a vote. What?
Those were the good days.
They were the good days. Or that we should have a referendum or a vote on whether the plan is a good idea or not. Not a lot of people run these, and they don't seem very popular anymore. Similarly, some people make arguments like that it's not okay for the counterplan to be topical because if you read a topical counterplan, it actually affirms the resolution, and that's not an argument that the neg gets to be entitled to. Some people make the argument that only the affirmative gets fiat and the neg doesn't get fiat. I've never understood this argument, and I think it's not. I don't want to say that any argument is bad, but I think this argument is bad. You should probably just not say there's no neg fiat. There's one guy named Paul Straight, who's a policy dude, who's made the argument that agent counterplans are illegitimate. And the argument is basically like, look, if we're going to have a debate about whether the US federal government should do something, we would never resolve that debate by being like, you know, well, China should do it instead, right? Like, for instance, if you're having a debate about what kind of car you should buy, and you're like, well, I could buy, you know, a Kia, and it would only cost me $10,000, but it would be a piece of crap. Or I could buy a BMW, which is a great car, but costs 5 times more, right? You would never say, counterplan, my friend should buy the BMW for me. Or he should buy it and I can drive it around, right? That's not a realistic way that we would ever have that debate. And so similarly, you wouldn't, basically, we shouldn't have debates about what the United States should do by saying it's like, gee golly whiz, wouldn't it be nice if China just passed the plan for us? Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't it be great if we could keep our peacekeepers at home and keep our money in our budget and have the AU do the plan? Wouldn't that be awesome, right? And there might be arguments about why, for that reason, agent counterplans are illegitimate. I think this argument is slightly more persuasive than most people think it is, but I still don't think it's very persuasive. But if you're interested in it, the guy's named Paul Straight, S-T-R-A-I-T, and he writes an article that's about 10 years old, in which he talks about why he doesn't think agent counterplans are kosher. The last note is, I've been talking a lot about arguments you should make to the MG, but the debate is not all about the MG. You should think in the PMC about what kind of counterplans your opponent might read. You should think about arguments about why your actor is key. Try or die or inevitability arguments are always really good because they can be really good to leverage in conjunction with the solvency deficit of the counterplan. Right? If you're winning that extinction is inevitable unless we do the plan, then any argument that even there's a tiny, tiny solvency deficit vis-a-vis the plan and the counterplan, or there's a tiny time frame deficit between the plan and the counterplan, can be really, really useful if you're winning a strong uniqueness or inevitability argument. You may also want to experiment with reading some critical affirmatives, critical frameworks, or do what's sort of a mixed AF where you have a straight up advantage and a critical advantage, where you can leverage the critical advantage against the counterplan and the counterplan won't solve it. And then in the PMR, like remember that in the PMR it's all about talking about the AF, why the AF is good, why the AF is better than the counterplan. And you have to sort of decide whether your frame for the PMR is going to be the permutation is best or the 1AC is best. But you know, you have to talk about the AF a lot in the PMR when you're debating against a big counterplan strategy. Solvency deficits are really critical. When I judge counterplan debates and I vote affirmative, it's almost always because the counterplan doesn't solve the case. And I think that's true of a lot of judges, and so I think that should probably be the biggest argument that you wave your hands about in the PMR. Remember, you always want to be asking about whether the permutation is capable of resolving or shielding the link to the disad, because if they don't win a disad, there's usually no net benefit to the permutation. So any argument that you have, not only about why the AF outweighs the disad, but also about why the AF is able to resolve their link question, is really important. And if you can't do these things and you made a counterplan theory argument, there's no shame in going for dispositionality bad, going for conditionality bad, consult bad, or any other theory argument. In fact, a lot of judges, you know, in a debate where it looks like you're losing everything, and you get up there and it's like, we're going all in on conditionality bad. A lot of judges, even if they don't vote for you, and they will vote for you more than you think they will. But even if they don't vote for you, they will give you serious props for having the cojones to actually make a decision about what to go for in the PMR, right? Because really as a judge, I see a lot of debates where, you know, it's usually a younger team and they'll just not really have a strategic vision about the round and they'll just go for a little bit of everything in the PMR and they'll be behind on everything. But sometimes you see a team where they're just like, look, we understand that we are just getting waxed on the solvency debate. We understand that we don't resolve the link to your distad, but your counterplan is artificially competitive, it's conditional, and it's not okay. This counterplan shouldn't be in debate, and you should lose because you read this counterplan. 5 minutes of that, and I'm always impressed, and sometimes I vote for them. So, remember, go forth, learn your craft.
And go to brandonmerrill.com.
It's really funny.
All right, thanks guys.
Thanks, Vinny.